From caterpillars and moons to little girls from the Maritimes, from talking animals to the terrors of puberty, books for toddlers, kids, and tweens covered just about every subject. Open a book, they say, and you open a mind. But what happens when tough tales get treated with a simplistic textual touch? What goes into the mind in that case, and how do words shape the generations to come? Welcome to Digesting Food Studies, the podcast that does a close reading of texts on food, food studies, food systems, and food culture, and then squirts out a stream of audio content. I'm your words processor and verbalist, David Santo. This episode looks at literature, the kind that's both for and about young people, and that specifically incorporates discourses about food. Our guests share perspectives on how these narratives are both shaped by and shape contemporary perspectives on eating and hunger, nutrition, shame, pride, and satiety, among many other foodish themes. And, as they note, when kids lit sticks to common societal tropes, food messages can come to be reified over time, stabilizing into a kind of reality in readers' minds from a very early age. At the same time, opening a book that's open to new ways of showing food issues is a great way to build towards a new age of justice and sustainability. The focus article today is Dian Day's Food Security in Books for Children, a Qualitative Content Analysis, and it's from Volume 11, Number 1 of Canadian Food Studies, published in March 2024. We start out with Alexia Moyer's Amuse, Bouche segment, and a classic from Québécoise literature that portrays some pretty sad truths about blame and shame and guilt when it comes to nourishing one's kids. Let's call it a lesson in the history of fictional realities, more than a real-time lesson in truth. For the Chewing on Research segment, Dian Day tells her story about reading children's stories about hunger and poverty, as well as the reasons for diving into this world with her research. She also shares the happy news of publishing her own kids' book about food insecurity and what's coming next, editorially speaking. And finally, in the aftertaste, former master's student Ruby Harrington offers up her response to Dian's article, as well as some complimentary thoughts on familial and infant food insecurity based on her own research experience. Hello, Alexia. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you, David.
Good. So today's episode is a somewhat tough subject, food insecurity for kids, but yes. You have a somewhat different approach to the subject that's going to lead us into us. Tell us more.
I do. I'm going to start us off with 3 food items. Mm-hmm. They are baked beans, and then onion fricassee, and a glass of good pasteurized milk, and the apparent hierarchy of these foods.
Okay.
So if one has to choose between the two, then the latter, the milk, is being held up in this context as the better choice. After all, milk contains, among other good things, calcium and phosphorus and vitamin D and protein, and it helps us build strong bones. If only Alphonse had chosen the milk, he would not now, in his medical exam, have cavities and poor vision. This is what is being not so subtly implied. Now, onions are actually high in vitamin C and folate and vitamin B6 and potassium, while beans are a source of protein and fiber and iron, but these virtues are not being considered here. Alphonse's mother, Rosanna Lacasse, is made to face her own failings vis-à-vis the medical profession. Here is a glimpse of her experience. She remembered now that at the clinic they had talked about rational nutrition, necessary for building bones and teeth and ensuring health. An almost laugh rose up in her throat. Hadn't they pointed out that this diet was within everyone's reach? Hadn't they clearly apprised her of her duty? She was suddenly filled with anxiety at the thought that she was in fact failing in her task. She became convinced of it. Now, for those of you who know your Gabriel Roy, you will have immediately deduced that Alphonse and Rosanna Lacasse are characters in the novel Bonheur d'Occasion, or
The Tin Flute.
The Tin Flute.
Ah, yes, thank you. Well, I'll wait to hear more, but you're really touching on a painful bit of literature that is also very telling about responsibility and blame.
Yes, this is a realist novel that is depicting the harsh living conditions of people in Montreal, in the Montreal neighborhood of Saint-Henri in the early 1940s. Now, I actually came to this novel through another book by historian Caroline Durand, which is published by McGill Queen's University Press, and it's called Nourrir la machine humaine, nutrition et alimentation au Québec, 1860 à 1945. So, Durand examines the history of nutrition in French-speaking Quebec between the second half of the 19th century and 1945, and she sets out to explore the ways in which various actors, such as doctors, the state, teachers, and certain food processing companies talk about nutrition. It's a big book. It's a good book, and I encourage you to read the whole thing. But since this is an Amuse Bouche and not the plat principal, or main course of the podcast, I am going to concentrate on the opening paragraphs. Durand starts off this monograph with an epigraph, excerpted from Gabrielle Roy's novel. Why does she do this? Well, partly because, rhetorically speaking, beginning with a story is always a good way to get your reader's attention.
As you have just done so beautifully.
And the tin flute, as Durand points out, does something unusual for its time. And this is because it contradicts ideas about the link between poverty and food and health that dominated in the early 1940s. So the novel undercuts popular ideas of the day. Roy depicts Saint-Henri residents as malnourished, thin bodies, and sick bodies. But the reason for this, as asserted by Roy, has to do with material conditions. They are suffering first and foremost from poverty. In other words, there are structural forces at work. As Durand has discovered, when Gabrielle Roy was writing, doctors and the federal, provincial, and municipal governments did not generally share this interpretation. The most frequently accepted conception at the time, which was delivered in the form of diets, food guides, nutritional information, advertisements, and recipes, was that malnourished individuals owed their condition not to economic factors, but to their ignorance of the basic principles of nutrition.
Because we should all just be smarter and then we will be healthier.
Right. And if we could just educate, particularly girls and women, in the discipline of nutritional science, then the population will be well fed.
Very much a pull yourself up by your own
bootstraps
kind of notion.
Yeah. So the prevailing advice was, and often still is, that individuals must inform themselves to make good choices. And the health of each person depends on these decisions. So good choices. Roy's characters do not have such choices between beans and onions on the one hand and good pasteurized milk on the other. And her novel helps Durand to reassess a discourse which on the surface seems neutral and objective and universally beneficial, but it really isn't.
Well, it's such an interesting insight because it, as we'll hear later on in the episode, it's, as you say, it's structural, it's systemic. Hunger is not simple.
Yes.
And every time it gets treated as simple, it doesn't get solved.
Yeah, and we don't always have the choices.
Yeah. Well, on a lighter note, I'm not going to go have an onion fricassee for lunch because that sounded kind of delicious.
And good for you too, I think.
Yeah. Dian Day is an author and poet who recently completed her PhD in Cultural Studies at Queen's University. There, she examined how poverty and food insecurity is depicted in fiction for kids, and then she went on to write her own book that expressed things a little differently. That work, Shy Cat and the Stuff the Bus Challenge, was published in March 2026 by Second Story Press, and the company has now confirmed that they will also publish Dian's picture book about a younger child experiencing food insecurity. Combined with her plan to eventually produce a young adult novel about the same issues, it's an impressive start to creating new understandings about hunger that go way beyond simplistic causality. Well, hi, Dian. Thank you so much for joining us on Digesting Food Studies. I'm really excited to talk to you about this really quite fascinating article about children's books and food insecurity that you published with Canadian Food Studies back in March 2024. It's a fascinating subject, and I want to know more. So please tell me, how did this article come about?
Well, there was a small group of food studies academic who I think had been meeting semi-regularly. They'd identified a pretty profound absence of books for kids about food insecurity. And I think one of them was looking themselves for a book that they could reach their own kids, and they were getting asked. They wanted to find something that they could recommend to their friends and colleagues. This is about maybe 5 years ago.
Okay.
So those folks were Elaine Power at Queen's, Jennifer Black at UBC, Jennifer Brady at Acadia. I'm part of that group, and Amanda White, who's at Emily Carr, is also. But at that point, it was the first three. And I had been working with Elaine on some other projects. I pretty much abandoned my previous doctoral work. And I was really at loose ends about what was next for me. And at that moment, Elaine actually asked me to join the group. And I think they had got to the point that, they felt that maybe they needed an actual writer. It didn't really make any sense that it would be me who was asked in many ways, but luckily for me, it was.
Well, it's an interesting space because food insecurity is obviously a major subject. It is part of the reason that CAFS as an association came about and Food Secure Canada. This is a huge challenge for the contemporary era. And yet pairing it with children's literature and children's books is a kind of extension of the research field, and certainly not one that I knew was going on until I heard your presentation at the CAFS conference and then read your article. But is it something that you were aware of before this group sort of coalesced and brought you into it?
No. I mean, I've always, because I had kids and grandkids, I've always read a lot of kids' books, but they were really hard to find. Any of the books, we were looking, we couldn't find anything we felt was recommendable, anything we felt kind of presented the issues in the way that we would want a kid to learn from. And it was not something until I did a focus study that became apparent. Yeah.
There are some books on food insecurity in children's literature and kids' literature, but it's the ways that whole complex situation, issue, challenge that people face when it comes to food insecurity was being presented in not what you think of as the very best way to communicate to kids, right? That was the sort of point of the article, was to lay out some of the critiques of how the issue of food insecurity or food security is presented and who gets identified as doing what within that context. And that was what really the article's about, yeah?
Yeah. As part of that process of we're going to make our own resource, I think there was this notion that maybe we would just be more systematic about what is out there. So I really took that on. So there was a picture book for younger children that basically made everybody kind of crazy. We wanted to know, was that representative of what was out there? And so I started looking initially at picture books, and there are really clear differences, in the books that are aimed at younger children, the middle grade, and the young adult books. The picture books really tend to celebrate food banks. They're really often written from a middle class perspective. They're generally more focused on donating to food banks rather than actually using food banks. And so often there are lessons in, for instance, like the importance of sharing. And if the child in the book is food insecure, there's kind of often this emphasis on giving back. So the message is kind of like, we'll give you food out of the goodness of our heart, but you just make sure you pay it forward.
Okay, so there's a kind of double pincer effect on the person who's being represented with food insecurity, in that they're both subject to the charitable givings of others who are better off, and also then subject to being forced into gratitude or forced into payback in some way.
Yeah.
Were there other problematic imagery or themes that were being presented that you found particularly difficult in some of the books that you were looking at?
There's a couple of exceptions. There are some really excellent picture books, but they were quite few and far between. And then I shifted to looking at the middle grade fiction, which is the focus of this article. Again, there are just not many books for this age group that foreground or center poverty and food insecurity. I think I identified maybe 24 that were published in North America in the past 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah. There are a lot of other issues that have kind of come to the fore and there's a lot of focus on, but poverty is not yet one of them. I mean, I think it's happening. It's starting to happen. There are more books being published, But anyway, so all these books, they had a child protagonist who was themselves dealing with food insecurity. So they were written from the perspective of a kid experiencing food insecurity, and all the stories were told in the first person. So then the tropes are like the kid is generally an only child or an oldest child. Sometimes there are younger siblings.
Mm-hmm.
And they really feel very responsible for holding their families together.
So they have to become a kind of hero for the family, even though they are hungry.
They have to be the adult, in fact,
Okay.
because there's just an inordinate number of dead parents, disappeared parents,
Mm-hmm.
incarcerated parents, absent parents. And if they're not absent, they're almost always unemployed.
So in some ways, there's a sort of a blame being placed on an inadequate parenting that then causes food insecurity.
Yeah. So the problem is that their parent isn't doing something
Mm-hmm.
the way that they should be or could be. And so given what their home lives look like, these kids are really exceptional. They have special artistic or musical abilities. They always have big brains. They always
Mm-hmm.
do well in school. They get good grades. And it doesn't seem to matter how hungry they are or what's happening at home. They're superhuman. I mean, it seems almost impossible that 11 or 12-year-olds could make the kinds of contributions to running the household that these kids are making. Even to the point of maybe getting part-time jobs, at 12.
Oh, wow.
So, despite the fact that most of their parents, if they have a parent in the story, the parent's unemployed.
So hooray, the solution to childhood food insecurity is child employment.
Child employment. There's a whole range of little jobs, whether that's babysitting or, working at the corner store, sweeping up or,
Right.
That kind of thing. And their parents are irresponsible, they're disorganized, they're impulsive, they have maybe sometimes mental health issues or addiction issues. So we're really encouraged as readers to see the parent as the problem and the child as really having the capacity to pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
So instead of taking a systemic approach or a social conditions approach, it's just sort of making it basically a cause and effect blame on a specific person or situation in the family.
That's right.
That is resulting in the kid being hungry.
Yeah.
So in the article, you talk about how literature for kids, children's books, can be either a mirror or a window. I don't know why I never thought about it before, but it's a fabulous insight on what books do for kids. Can you say a little bit about that and why in particular the window or the mirror that kids' books about food insecurity with these somewhat problematic themes, what kind of mirrors and windows are being produced?
The windows and mirrors thing comes from this educator, Emily Style, and I think it was the 1980s, she was the one who kind of came up with that. So the windows or the doors allow kids to walk through into other lives and realities
Mm-hmm.
and experiences, and the mirrors allow kids to see themselves, show kids their own realities reflected back at them, validate them, really. And Style had argued that good children's literature should provide both those things, windows and mirrors. When you have a book that really plays on stereotypical portrayals of people living in poverty or experiencing food insecurity, if we're not giving kids accurate information, then I think we can't deal with the issue effectively.
So if the book's a mirror, it's reflecting a problematic perspective back onto the kid that the kid may not actually feel, but then suddenly thinks, oh, this is how I should be feeling, or this is what is wrong with my life.
Yeah.
And if it's a window, then they might be then starting to other their friends even more by seeing food insecurity as a blame-related issue rather than a systemic-related issue.
Yeah. So kids living with poverty and food insecurity and middle-class kids are kind of more likely to see these issues as individually caused and individually solved.
Mm-hmm.
And also to maybe be more likely to see food banks and other community supports as sites for shame. Because that's the other thing in this group of books. If a food bank is introduced in the plot, then the child protagonist is always concerned about being seen.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they are always seen there by the person that is kind of like the last person the child would want them to see. So it's either their best friend or their arch enemy.
So they're these shame magnifiers, these spaces. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in response to all this, you have written your own book. In fact, you, along with Amanda White as artist, have created a new book for kids about food insecurity that presumably doesn't do all the problematic things that are in your qualitative analysis. So tell me about that. What's first of all, what's the name of the book?
The book is called Shy Cat and the Stuff the Bus Challenge.
Shy Cat and the Stuff the Bus Challenge. Okay, so who is Shy Cat and what is the Stuff the Bus Challenge?
Okay, well, the book is a graphic novel, and Amanda White did the art. So the two protagonists, Mila and Kit, neither one of their families have very much money, but Kit is also food insecure. And Mila is the narrator, and she asks a lot of questions and gradually pieces things together about her friends. The Stuff the Bus Challenge is a thing that happens in real life.
Mm-hmm.
They're almost ubiquitous now. I would imagine most people would have come across them in some form or another. Lots of schools are having them, but also other kinds of organizations. It's essentially a food drive or a local food bank, and often set up as a challenge or a competition to see who can bring in the most donations.
Okay, so filling the bus up with canned goods, basically.
With
shelf-stable
canned
stuff.
and packaged goods. Yeah, shelf-stable. And because it's a competition, there's a prize. In this case, in the book, the prize is a pizza party for the winning class.
Oh.
Yes, exactly. And there's really rarely any analysis in real life, in these classrooms about why some families don't have enough food, why food banks are seen as necessary, what the limitations of food banks are. And in addition to that, there's really rarely any acknowledgement that there may be, and I think often are, kids in the class whose families are food insecure and who may need to access food banks sometimes. So in the book, we wanted to make those things clearer, that food banks, in fact, do not solve food insecurity, and they never will. And we also wanted readers to think about how it might feel if you didn't always have enough to eat and your school was holding a food drive.
And you might feel compelled to contribute to it, even though you yourself don't have enough to eat.
Exactly. And that's exactly the position that Kit is in the book.
Wow. Well, I am very excited that this book exists. It is now, in fact, in bookstores. And I'm excited to put a link to the publisher's website in the show notes so that people can find it. They can buy it. They can read it to their kids. And I'm always so excited when creative, literary, artistic folks who are also academics work on producing knowledge in ways that isn't just another article in a journal. Even though I love our journal and I love our authors' articles, having a little bit of other material out there, like you have produced with Amanda, is a wonderful way to change the dialogue, to start kids learning from a young age about food insecurity from a more complex perspective. So thank you for that. Thank you very much for the wonderful article, which is also a great academic article in Canadian food studies. And it's been great talking to you.
I think we all have to be more creative in the world, really, especially right now. Like, big challenges and big problems are multiplying. I don't think that's our imagination. So I think if we can come at it differently, learn about it differently, talk about it differently, maybe something different will happen.
Well, thanks for contributing to that movement.
Okay.
Ruby Harrington is a communications and outreach officer with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, helping to build towards social, economic, and environmental justice. Previously, she was a master's student with the Fed Family Lab at Acadia University in Nova Scotia, where she examined the role of public policy in Canada and the US during the 2022 infant formula shortages.
I'm Ruby Harrington, and I am a master's student at Acadia University and a research assistant at the Fed Family Lab. Since 2022, I have worked on the lab's joint report card on child and family poverty in Nova Scotia with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Nova Scotia branch. My master's thesis draws from the lab's Finding Formula project, which investigates the 2022 infant formula shortage. Specifically, I am examining the role of public policy and informal networks of primarily mothers in response to the shortage. In Day's article, one of the ideas that stands out to me is the emphasis on individual action rather than structural change. Support from friends, family, neighbors, or librarians is often framed as deserving just for this particular child, who is typically described as exceptional, or the super poor kid, as Day says. This child isn't like the stereotypical low-income child. They are able to stay on top of their schoolwork, maintaining good grades, while ensuring their younger siblings are fed. Overall, the child exhibits shame for not conforming to middle-class ideals and tries their best to hide their food insecurity and poverty. This deserving child is one that conforms. For middle-class kids, food insecurity is just a matter of bad luck. It's something that could happen to anyone. But for low-income kids, food insecurity is something that they can change through hard work. This is particularly relevant to me, as infant formula has been something that caregivers across Canada have struggled to access and afford long before the 2022 infant formula shortages. For a bit of context, in early 2022, an Abbott Nutrition formula plant closed for 3 months due to concerns of infant death related to their formulas. While no evidence was found that the deaths were related, the closure resulted in mass shortages across the United States and into Canada, since at that time, 100% of the infant formula in Canada was imported. This made national news as parents were struggling to find formula and feed their babies. As a result, caregivers in Canada and the US turned to social media, making Facebook groups posting when they had extra formula, where infant formula was available at stores, and asking for support when they had exhausted all other resources. While this is undoubtedly a massive issue, access to infant formula has always been precarious for low-income caregivers. And in response, the solution was often telling caregivers to breastfeed more because it's seen as the free and easy option. And there was some of that throughout the formula shortage, but it was broadly seen as bad luck, something that could happen to anyone, rather than, as Day quotes, deliberate social and political structural arrangements that disadvantage the poor and actively advantage the middle and wealthy class. For me, Day's article has been useful in unpacking perceptions of poverty and food insecurity, and how these perceptions are reinforced by media starting at a young age. For more general use, I think that this piece emphasizes the importance of what children are consuming. How are children learning to think about, feel, or interact with people living in poverty or in food insecure homes in popular media? And even further, how do these perceptions impact children who are living in poverty or in food insecure homes themselves?
I was never much of a reader as a kid, except for a few choice volumes like the Arabian Nights and collections of Greek and Norse mythology. Instead, my preteen eyes were pretty much glued to the TV, where I watched such standards as Gilligan's Island, The Brady Bunch, MASH, and The Electric Company. And yes, some of those classics have aged better than others. Yet, contrary to expectations, my brain did not rot. In fact, I now realize I learned quite a lot about the world through these shows, including things like physics and chemistry, and human relations and fashion, anatomy, biology, design, art, performance. My little brains are vacuums, and mine sucked up a lot of background knowledge, along with the dust bunnies and laugh tracks. Anyway, just think what potential there is to train kids on food studies and systems thinking, if only the right TV or fiction writer were to come along. My thanks to our terribly literate and delightfully articulate guests, Alexia Moyer, Dian, and Ruby Harrington. You inspire me to turn back to my bedside pile of unread novels. Digesting Food Studies executive producers are Rachel Engler-Stringer, Laurence Godin, Charles Levko, Phil Loring, and Kristen Lowett, and I'm David Santo. If you're looking for more reading suggestions, follow Canadian Food Studies posts on the social media accounts of the Canadian Association for Food Studies. We pair book reviews from the journal with recommendations for complementary texts, both fiction and nonfiction, and it's a great way to put literature into dialogue with lived experience. And of course, check out the show notes for this episode to find links to some of the many references we've mentioned. Children's literature reflects the worlds around us, both by what it includes and what it doesn't. It also has the capacity to change those worlds and to make things better for the people and stories that aren't always foregrounded by dominant cultures. Today, as books are being removed from libraries or banned from circulation more generally, we risk letting quieter voices and less commonly held perspectives be hidden, lost, and ignored. But just as food systems need diversity and resilience, so do literary ones. Now is the time to stand up and demand access to these ideas for our kids, for ourselves, our societies, and our future.